Today we are interviewing Roberta Studwell, who is the Associate Dean for Law Library and Information Services and Associate Professor of Law at Ave Maria School of Law. Bobbie, as she prefers to be called, formerly served in leadership roles at several law school libraries. Bobbie, let's begin with a little personal history. Could you tell us about your life, perhaps when you were young and then perhaps today?
Yes, I'm excited to be here, Pat, and I wanted to thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure doing these interviews, as I have said in several of them in the past.
This is really an exciting venture that you're making us take with you, and I think it'll be a good.
Oh, thank you. Well, I can't take the credit. I get to do some of the interviews, but others have thought of the basic concepts, and so I will share, but I won't name names because I don't really know who exactly thought of what.
Right. Well, to start off with, I was born and raised or reared in Phoenix, Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
I am a member of a family of 4 kids and 2 very, very loving parents who are no longer with us.
Mm-hmm.
My brother was 4 years older, and I have a sister who's a twin sister. So we grew up actually immersed in music. We were immersed in education. My parents were not college educated, either of them. And in fact, my mother's claim to fame is getting her GED degree after she started her family.
Mm-hmm.
So it was exciting for them and for us to have two of their children go to college. My sister graduated with her degree in music from Willamette University in Oregon, Salem, Oregon, and I graduated from the Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, many, many years ago now. It feels like it was forever ago. The thing that I remember most about my childhood that relates back to what I do today is my father. And the trips that he would take in the summer with us to the public library. Phoenix was very small when I was young. It was really kind of a medium-sized, small town, suburban, I wouldn't even call it a city back then. It was more of a desert oasis in a lot of ways. And they had one of the best public libraries in the country. And the reason I say that is they had a children's library, even when I was a youngster, that was set off from everything. It had its own collection. It had wonderful librarians who manned it, who made recommendations to children, and we would go there literally every week with my father. I'd probably check out 8 books, and over the summer I would immerse myself in reading and thinking, and I, of course, aspired to be a writer at one point in time when I was a little kid. But those are the kinds of things about my childhood that I remember. My parents were very interested in making sure that their children succeeded and making sure that their education came to some worthwhile benefit for their children. We were very interested in that. So my sister and I think, met that goal for them, and the icing on the cake was both of us getting our master's degree. She has her master's in music education, mine in librarianship, and then after getting my degree in librarianship, decided to go on to get my degree in law. So I did it not in the same order that many of our colleagues do,
But many do it that way as well. Lolly Gassaway, with whom I worked at the beginning of my career, was our catalog librarian, and she decided to go to law school at the University of Houston, where we were working. And so she did it the way you did. And, she's, I believe, gone on to do well in our field too.
yes, she has.
As you have.
She's a wonderful, wonderful mentor. She's been somebody that I've been able to talk to and rely on, especially for copyright advice now.
Well,
she
certainly became our expert in that field,
Yes.
And has done a lot for us and our broader profession of libraries in general, with testimony before Congress and
Yes.
things of that sort over the years.
She's been
Yeah.
very active.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of talking with her on one of these interviews some months ago, and I'm looking forward to when that becomes public on Hein Online, which will hopefully not be too far in the distant future.
Hopefully.
Yeah, because they're putting only a few a month up so that the project will not overwhelm our viewers by
Yes.
too many at once, and yet will be sort of ongoing as we get more
Right.
in the pipeline of more interviews done. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to seeing them. I really am.
Thank you.
I think it'll be
Thank
fun
you.
to,
Yeah.
fun to see.
Yeah.
Well, I'll fill in some of the gaps
Yeah.
before.
Well, you
getting that
you have
degree.
gone to school. You didn't mention where you went to library school or law school eventually. Would you like to mention those? And then,
Well, let me talk a little bit about Arizona State. Even as I went through the program there, I toyed with the idea of getting my degree. I was an English ed major at
Okay.
that point in time.
Mhm.
And I toyed with the idea of going into librarianship even then. I had a mentor who was strongly encouraging me to go into the field of educational psychology. But I decided instead to get married, and my husband and I left for Moscow, Idaho, and he started his degree in wildlife resources up in Moscow, and I started looking for a job. I had been teaching 7th and 8th grade English up until that point in time, and it was a small town. A lot of teachers were married to the professors at the university. And fortunately for me, in the humanities library at the University of Idaho, a position came open the summer that we arrived. It took a while for it to be advertised and the recruiting process to be completed, and you and I both know how that goes, but...
Especially in a state system,
yes.
they have all the rules that have to be followed.
Exactly. And I was fortunate enough to start my career actually as a clerical paraprofessional at the University of Idaho's Humanities Library. I had a lot of people who encouraged me during my tenure there because of my organizational skills, I think, to move on and go into librarianship. And so I started to explore the summer program in librarianship, which was still viable at the University of Washington. I don't remember who keyed me into it, but it was somebody who was at the undergraduate library where I was working. And I applied, and lo and behold, I got accepted, and Idaho, the state, gave me a grant to get my degree, and I started to go over to the summer program, which was just being phased out, absolutely, completely phased out this summer that I started. And unfortunately for me, my husband was in a motorcycle accident that summer. And I had to put things off for a summer and actually make it up after they had actually ceased the program. I was lucky enough that they worked with me on completing that degree, which I completed around 1990, somewhere, 1980, excuse me. And it was a great program. I really enjoyed the Studwell library and the professors that I had. And even then, Pat, I was interested in computers and electronics. Some of my colleagues were actually taking any of the courses that they could that were fairly simplistic, we'll say. And when I said...
Traditional, perhaps.
There you go.
No of these electronic gadgets involved.
And I decided that I would take the first class that they offered in informatics that was attached to the library school.
Yeah.
And I had to take Fortran before they would allow me into that class. And I remember being fascinated by it. My husband was taking a Fortran class at that time as well. So we did it together, which was fun and interesting for me. I don't know if it was for him. And I learned a lot from that class. The organizational skill set blended well with my skills and my desires and my interests. And I just had an inkling at that point in time that this is the way information access was going to go. And when I got back to the University of Idaho, we were actually starting the first dialogue databases that were accessible to the public. And I remember trying to print things out and use a printer that wasn't attached to anything, and making sure your queries were right so that you would get the right information. It was really interesting going through that time. I know people who are much younger will go, but of course we've always had keyboards, but no, we haven't always had keyboards.
And we haven't had Fortran for a while for most of us either.
Exactly.
That was one of the early systems for making the magic come out of those machines.
Yes, it was. It was, and writing the cards and doing key punching, which was my mother's occupation, as a matter of fact.
So you were still working with the punched cards?
Yes.
And then the machine would probably never accept them the first time or two.
It would spit them out with all the errors, and I'd have to go back and read through the lines of code and correct them.
Today's students have never experienced anything like that, and I'm on their side that you don't want to experience it if you don't have to.
I agree.
Yeah.
Although it's helped me a lot with my web developers who are working with code, because I know the intricacies, and I know that a comma, period, paren, bracket will set the whole entire line of code off and make something float up here where it should be down here.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I guess it's helpful information. But I digress. I finished that degree, and actually I know one of the things that might interest people listening is I remained at the University of Idaho undergraduate library, and all of a sudden this summer that I graduated, I saw an opening for the law library. And when I saw
coming
that
over to the dark
opening-
side, or some of our colleagues in other libraries might say.
And I really didn't know anything about law librarianship, but I did know that it was time for me to be looking for a job. This seemed like a good opportunity. My husband was going to be in Idaho finishing his degree for another couple of years, and so I applied. And I was interviewed by two wonderful colleagues, Rita Roosh and Walter McLeod.
Oh, I remember both of them. Walter, of course, is no longer with us, but he was a wonderful person, and Rita's a nice person too.
Rita was actually pretty integral in getting me to really strongly consider taking the position. I do not know what their candidate pool was. Of course, I shouldn't know. But when she saw my application and after the interview, she must have been impressed, because she really encouraged me to come into the profession, told me quite a bit about it, and she and Walter both during the interview seemed interested in having somebody who'd worked in the capacity that I had worked in at the main library for a couple of reasons. It was a cataloging position. It was in technical services. And I think both of them knew that I would have access to some of the cataloging resources that were needed. So I was there in, perhaps, at least a bit, in getting some cataloging that had not been attended to in a while up to date. And in fact, there was a very large backlog. It was about a year and a half worth of cataloging backlog, which I was able to successfully complete very, very quickly. But the one thing that I would like to say about both of them is they were easy people to work with. Walter was someone who promoted his staff, and if I learned anything there, it was that. Walter McLeod was quite a bit older than I was. He was a true gentleman. He would open the door for you and insist on doing so. He had kind words to say about everyone. And the reason I bring that around to my point, he wrote one of the most fantastic letters of recommendation for me when I applied to go to AALL and ask for a Matthew Bender scholarship. And I know to this day that that's why I am a Bender baby. He was able to get a Bender scholarship through his wonderful
He
letter of
must have pulled
recommendation.
strings, because years ago I was on the other end of the scholarships. I was the chair of the committee. And the Bender scholarships were the ones that people really wanted to get if they could. Any scholarship was good, but the Bender one meant you became a Bender baby and got invited back to those marvelous dinners
Yes.
that they had every year
Exactly.
at the annual meeting, because only the Bender babies and a few of us extra hang-ons, I got into that mix at some point, got to go to those. And it actually was an interesting political process, because the committee vetted all the candidates and ranked them and evaluated them, and then I, as chair, basically just did the last step. But one of the things in the last step was who I picked to get Bender scholarships as opposed to some of the others. And people wanted to know if I had, nepotism was there or not. Turned out I just took the highest ranked people that year. I shouldn't maybe say this on camera. Somebody might go back to see what they got that year if they were an awardee and think, oh, he wasn't talking about me, or he was. I don't know. But
Well, I don't know why you picked me, or your committee did, and perhaps it was. This would have been in 1981. I think it was the Washington meeting. And I was accepted to...
I was the year it was in New York, so I'm safe.
There you go.
When I've just said how I did it. Actually, I didn't know any of the people, so I didn't, if I wanted to be playing favorites, I didn't know who to play anyhow, but I figured I'd better be very careful.
It was quite an honor, and they had a great event at the meeting that year, and I believe that was the year I met you, Pat.
Probably so.
I think I was actually not... I actually applied to be on a committee, and it was the publications committee. Yeah. And was my first meeting, and I met you during that meeting.
Well, I was involved in that meeting. Steve Margison and I were, he's a colleague across town in Washington, and I was there at the time. And that was one of the last years before the association hired an executive director to manage it. He was being hired at that time, but it was still the member volunteers doing an awful lot of the stuff that we now have professionals do for us, because it was so overwhelming. People just can't do everything, and the professionals really do know, and they're not reinventing the wheel every year or so. But Steve and I were involved in running the exhibit hall that year.
Oh, really?
And it was quite an experience.
It was a great meeting. I'll never forget it. I made many friendships and met many acquaintances who I still know and talk with regularly, and I probably...
That's the thing about our profession. I mean, there are a lot of us, but we're still a small group, and we do get to know each other.
Yes,
and
we do.
It's wonderful.
It's nice to know how many children people have and be able to ask how everyone in the family is doing, and those are the kinds of interactions I look forward to every year at the meeting.
Well, we sort of digressed a bit, and it's been interesting, but shall we get back? So you became a law librarian. You were working as a degreed librarian at the university in Moscow, Idaho, the University of Idaho, and with Walter and Rita and others. Rita obviously played a part. Were there any others who played any kind of a particular role in recruiting you into, our end of the profession?
Well, I will say that there was one more person who took Rita's place at the University of Idaho. Rita was one of the smartest people I'd ever met and known, and still is. She has been a mentor to me since she recruited me for that position. But the person who took her place was as well, and that was Lynn Foster. Lynn Foster, who is at UALR, came on. She wasn't at Idaho very long, and in fact, I wasn't at Idaho for more than a couple of years as the technical services librarian. But Lynn and I met, and we recruited her to come and work for us as our associate director, and she did. And Lynn knew so many people in the profession. I was astounded at how many introductions she could and did make of me, of other people at the annual meetings. And in fact, the trip that I'll never forget was Walter agreed to send Lynn and Trish Cervenka and I over to Washington, to Seattle, to actually go and look at what was going on at some other libraries. So we took a road trip from Moscow, Idaho, over to Seattle, and we visited.
Bit of a drive,
It
too.
was. It was
Those states
fun.
out there are a little larger than,
They-
some of the east
They
are.
are. And we took a trip up to Gonzaga
All right, in Spokane.
in Spokane. Dennis Stone was the director at
Oh,
that
yeah.
point in time.
Mhm.
We visited the University of Puget Sound.
All right, in
And-
Tacoma.
Yes, in Tacoma, and I met Bob Baring for the very first time during that trip. He had just taken over, I think maybe 1 year in the making of the wonderful Marion Gallagher.
Oh,
who was
at the University of
director at
Washington.
the
Yes,
University
that's
of
right. He was
Washington.
there not too long a period because he then went down to California to Bolt Hall. But
Correct.
he took the reins after Marion had retired,
He
and
did.
yeah.
And he was, he and Lynn had known each other in Illinois, and he was gracious enough to let us sleep in his basement in his house that night. It was really a wonderful trip. I'll never forget it.
Yeah.
I'll never forget it. And those were the folks, I would say, those three. Pierce Cervenka was going to law school at that point in time. Lynn encouraged me to think about going to law school, and I did. I decided to think very, very strongly about it at Idaho, but I took another job. I went to Portland. It was a dream of mine to be a little bit closer to family. My sister had actually moved to the Portland area. She was in Salem, Oregon, Yelm, Washington area during that time period, and I wanted to be a little bit closer to family, and so we moved to Portland, and I worked for Lewis and Clark Law School, Lewis and Clark College Law School. I cannot remember what the Northwestern School of Law, I believe it was called at that point in time.
Was Jackie Jerkins
Jackie was
involved
not.
with you a little bit, or was not at that time?
I met Jackie, and we
Yeah.
did have, I met her at a couple of events that we had for the Portland Area Library
Yeah.
Association. But Peter Nickham was the librarian
Yes.
who hired me at
All right.
the,
Yeah.
at that.
Yeah, he's
to be the
somebody that
reference
I've been trying to
librarian.
get in touch with to see if we could be doing an interview of him, and haven't been able to make
Haven't
contact yet. But Jackie is also, that's why I asked about her, because she's been the law librarian at the courthouse library in Portland, Multnomah for I think 50 years or something. It's a very long tenure, and I know that she at various points has been involved at the law school, as well as probably every other library within not too great a distance from Portland, Oregon.
That's
over
very
the years,
true. That's
as
very true.
helping out or advising or whatever she's done.
Well, as is true with most libraries, we had very limited parking at Lewis and Clark, and so often we would refer people down to the downtown area, to the county law library, letting them know what a great resource it was.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, I just like to mention that Peter was just this outgoing force at Lewis and Clark. He was involved in teaching, he was involved in recruiting, he was involved in buildings. He was probably somebody who I took a lot of my management lead from in more ways than anyone would know. I was not young when I got into the profession, but I also was still learning, and I learned a lot from watching Peter operate the operation. He was very heavily involved in making sure that that collection moved the right direction into the environmental area, which is something that I had never even thought about. He hired some really good people while I was there, and I was really excited to be their reference librarian, and that was when it really hit me that I needed to go off to get the law degree. When students would come to the desk and ask questions about civil procedure, I knew then that it was something that I needed to do, but the question was whether I should stay there and get the degree, because they did have a night program, or whether I should move somewhere else. So I began to look around and made a decision to move to Miami, Florida. And Wes Daniels was the director at the University of Miami when I decided to become there.
Yeah.
And he made me a deal that I just could not refuse. He
Well, to make you move that far, I mean, unless you'd come from Hawaii or Alaska, I don't think you'd get much farther
Very
away from
true.
Florida, Oregon and Washington State.
Very true. Now, my husband's from the East Coast, so
Uh-huh.
I had visited out east quite often. But Wes was anxious to fill a reference position. I found out later why, but he offered me a tuition scholarship plus the job. And that is why I ended up going to the University of Miami. for
Oh,
my
tuition
law degree.
remission, that is
Yes.
very attractive. And
It was.
private education traditionally has. I put 2 kids through college and didn't have to pay tuition. It was
Exactly.
wonderful.
Exactly, and the way he brokered the deal, I had to pay the difference in the tuition each year, which I think I finished law school with $3,000 or $4,000 in debt, which was pretty significant.
Today's
but-
graduates couldn't believe their ears. They hear that
Very
answer.
true, that's very true.
Yeah.
But University of Miami was struggling to kind of right the ship. They had a great international collection, but they really were not what I would call a service organization. Up until the point in time I came on board, Wes was looking to correct service ethics there. None of the reference librarians had desks out in the public area. There was a circulation desk, there was no reference desk. I was their first person to man people, staff a reference desk at the University of Miami. And in fact, within a year, they built a reference desk right across from the circulation desk. It's no longer there, but it was built at that point in time.
So people could find you when they had the question rather than trying to figure out how to find you when they had the question.
And I think that's where I cut my teeth on reference. It was one of the busiest reference interaction stations, bar none, that I've ever been affiliated with. I like to tell the story of having stacks and stacks of paper up above my head on my desk in the reference office that I never got to until the semester ended because I was so busy at the desk. There were times that I was probably there 7.5 hours of some days. It was really great because I learned so much. I learned about the collection, I learned about serials, I learned about cataloging, and I was going to law school, so I learned about the law. It was probably the best educational librarian could have.
Sounds like it must have been very satisfying. I mean, you were busy, so you certainly felt that you were needed, I'm sure. And I was a reference librarian in my salad days too in this profession, and I think in many ways, maybe some of our colleagues will disagree, but I think it's one of the most interesting jobs in the library because every day is different.
It is.
And you just don't know who or what's going to walk up and ask something, and well, I shouldn't say what, but what they'll ask.
Right, you don't.
And it makes the job very interesting. The only other one that comes close, I think, is the head librarian, the director, because that you're dealing with what nobody else is dealing with because it walks up and you don't know what it's going to be until it gets there.
That's true. And you have all those constituencies that you have to deal with as a director.
Yeah, reference librarians don't have to worry about some of that.
No,
So much.
fortunately.
Yeah.
I saw some of that on the peripheries every once in a while, but no, I didn't have to deal with the professors that were angry because they're male.
So you ended up at Miami, at the University of Miami, and from there you've had an interesting career. You're now at Ave Maria, which is I think of it as a relatively new school. I know they started, I think, up in Michigan, and they moved down here in the law school. But you also have been through a variety of different types of law libraries, academic, large ones like Idaho, well established, Colorado, newer ones, including where you are now, and Cooley, and I think were you at Barry at one
Charlotte.
point? Charlotte. Yeah, I knew there was another one. Could you talk a little bit about that kind of experience? Because most of us didn't have quite that variety. At least I certainly didn't.
You know how to stay put. I don't.
Well, I don't know about that, or I get into a rut and I'm afraid to take a chance on a move. I'm not sure what it is, but yeah, you're right. You've had You've had more of a variety, not only in different places, but different sort of types of schools, different points in their development. Could you talk a little bit about some of that?
Certainly, I enjoyed my time at Colorado. Barbara Bentliff hired me to be her associate director right after I graduated from, actually hadn't even quite graduated from the University of Miami. I finished my last 2 classes at Colorado. I took a class in water law and international law. I know that sounds a little strange, but it was fun. And as the associate director of a school that was a state school, I learned a lot from Barbara about management. I learned a lot from her staff in particular. My colleagues there were excellent hires. She had made some wonderful decisions and surrounded herself with great people. And I learned a lot more about technical services activities and how to deal with personnel management, which is something that most directors find is a sticking point many times.
A challenge.
A challenge, yes, and an opportunity at the same time. I stayed there for about 3 years, and I think, I won't call it wanderlust. I am one of those people who likes a challenge, and I will say that although I was still being a reference librarian and I was an associate director, there wasn't as much activity as there was at Miami, and I found myself not feeling as challenged as I had when I was at the University of Miami. So when the opportunity came up at the Cooley School of Law, I decided that I would put my application in just to see if anything came of it. And lo and behold, they asked me out for an interview and offered me the job, and I took the position there. The challenge at Cooley was that it was an independent, standalone law school with no support system. That was quite the opportunity. You learn how to manage technology. You learn how to manage not only people that are librarians, but also IT folks, which were under me at that point in time. You learn how to broker deals with outside libraries that might be able to supply support for collections that you're never going to be able to afford. You establish connections, and I think that's probably where I learned to network best with other colleagues, was when I was at the Cooley School of Law. The folks there within the Midwest were some of the friendliest I've ever met. And I would say that I made a lot of friends with the Mishal and the Oral people that were in the vicinity at that point in time. I learned a lot from them. They always offered to help. And during that time period, they were looking for leadership. And although I had been the president of COAL, the Colorado Association of Law Libraries, more or less by fiat rather than by desire.
Well, you were still president, so.
I was.
Might as well take the credit, because you got all the blame for anything that somebody didn't like that year.
That's true. That was a programmatic challenge, I will admit. It kept me very, very busy. Yeah. But I was in a couple of leadership positions while I was at Mishal. And I think the networking opportunities, because you had to form those relationships with people in order to have places to send your students who had no place to study, perhaps because your facilities were limited, and offering opportunities for collection, because we had to do a lot of collection brokering and borrowing, was an opportunity.
Well, you were sort of by yourself up in Lansing, as I recall, for the school, and that's. I have a daughter and her family who live in Grand Rapids now, so I've seen Lansing and the school actually coming sort of through quickly, and so you're not exactly right next door to everybody else.
No, it is really smack dab in the center of the state. It's an interesting city because of the state offices that are there, and there are again more networking opportunities because of that. The model that Cooley was following at that point in time was to become the biggest and the best.
Uh-huh.
And I know they've achieved the biggest. At one point in time, I think they were bringing in 3,000 students. And that was when
Pretty good
they
size.
decided that
Yeah.
they would have three more branches.
Now, one of them's down here in Florida, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah,
One of
I
them
think
is
I
actually
read
right
that.
in the Tampa area.
Oh, is it?
Yes, it
Yeah,
is.
we're near there today in Gulfport. Yeah, it's Stetson.
And they're very, very close to here.
Uh-huh.
And established their program started about a year and a half ago.
All
They
right.
brought in I think they brought in an evening class, but
Mhm.
don't hold me to that, I'm not sure. But I've kept in close contact with many of the people there, and actually, I think, helped hire their current director, and that's Dwayne Stroney, who
Mhm.
I had worked with it. Believe it or not, it's a very incestuous group, as you know.
Oh, I know that. We all know each other and work together, or at least
Yes.
work together on association sorts of things,
Yes,
or
we do.
doing law school accreditation or whatever. Yeah.
And Dwayne actually came up to become my associate director
Mhm.
at Cooley, and when I left, he became the director at
Good.
Cooley, and took over the hard work of developing all of those branch libraries
Mhm.
that now exist. I decided to move on after my daughter graduated from high school. A brand new opportunity had opened up in a brand new school in a state that never had had a law library before, and that was UNLV in Las Vegas, Nevada.
That's right.
And it was a challenge in that I came in after a beloved director and dean had been there for a number of years, kind of pulling the educational enterprise up by its bootstraps, so to
Mhm.
speak. It was a school that had achieved accreditation in record time, and they were all a part of making it that. So it was an interesting experience coming in and having things fairly well established,
Mhm.
but also knowing that there were other things that needed to be done. They hadn't achieved the staffing level that they had wanted. They hadn't achieved the technology accoutrements, shall we say, that they had wanted. And they were still looking for their niches. They had established clinics, and that was a challenge in
Mhm.
terms of being able to supply them with a collection. The library was up on the third floor, and the clinic offices, as you can imagine, were on the first floor. So even just by virtue of being in the same building, we didn't have direct access to each other's collections. That presented some challenges. Didn't have as much opportunity for access with the students as I thought there might be either, by virtue of being on that third floor. So there was a lot of marketing that I learned about and started to develop as I was a member of that faculty in that law school. I would say that presented the biggest challenge, was that marketing challenge at UNLV.
Well, it was relatively new even in those days, wasn't it? Yeah.
It was only, I started there in their 4th year of operation.
Okay, yeah.
And I stayed there for 5 years.
Yeah, I knew they were relatively new, but I wasn't sure that they were that relatively
Right.
new at the
They
time.
were.
Yeah.
And I would say the highlight of being there was hosting 2 association meetings while I was there. Both within a period of, I think, 12 months. And that was the Westpac meeting was at UNLV while I was there. And the Cali meeting was held there just literally the month that I left to take a position at Charlotte School of Law out in North Carolina.
So if you were smart when you interviewed at Charlotte, you asked the dean 2 questions. Are you planning to have a Cali meeting or any other? And if the answer was yes, then your answer was no.
Oh, right, exactly. Well, Charlotte was an interesting option for me because it was a startup, but to be honest with you, it was the dean who I thought was going to be somebody that I really would enjoy working with, and that was why I took the position. Jean Clark was the dean at Charlotte when I applied, and Jean was from Australia, and they had recruited him, Infolaw had recruited Jean to come and open the Charlotte campus of the consortium, and he was just a marvelous servant leader. I've never seen anybody who epitomized servant leadership the way that Gene Clark did. And I knew that I could work with him. My example from being there and working with him was my first senior staff meeting, which I'd never been a part of anywhere else, and all of the major managers, the associate dean for faculty, the associate dean for students, the HR people, et cetera, were around a table talking weekly about what was going on, how to improve it, how to sustain things that were going well. And I was quiet that first meeting. And the second meeting, he wasn't going to allow that to happen.
You needed a participant.
He called me out, he did, and he said, "You have a lot to offer, I expect to hear from you."
Yeah.
And, you know, that was both an invitation and a challenge, and
Certainly.
I took him up on it. I became an active participant in those meetings, and to be honest with you, I learned more about law schools at Charlotte School of Law than I probably learned anywhere else that I had worked. I learned about the mechanics of administration. I learned about recruiting. I learned about admissions more than I had even at the UNLV, and I was on the admissions committee. I learned more about budgets than anyone would ever want to know. And I learned how to work consortially with my colleagues at Phoenix School of Law and at Florida Coastal. And it was a very, very challenging but a very rewarding experience. In addition, it was going through accreditation. I joined them 1 year after they had basically hit the ground and opened their doors. And the challenge in joining them a year late was that I didn't get to know that first group crop of students as well as I might have liked.
Yeah, usually the first year is when you really connect with the students.
Exactly.
I've found from in my experience.
Right, and I really enjoyed the group that came in when I did, but they were quite a group, that first group. They had been able to attract some really bright, committed students who were taking a chance. And you could tell that that was going to be something that epitomized them. They had to establish clubs and organizations. They had to write bylaws. They met every challenge that you can imagine a student group would have to.
The sort of thing students in most law schools sort of come in and they just take for
Right.
granted are there, and they are. But
Exactly.
yeah, you're right. Somebody has to start all that.
Yes, they do. And we had started the administration. They had to start the school organizations. And the other challenge, of course, was accreditation. We were literally visited every year that I was there. I wrote 3 self-studies, I think, while I was there, and it was rewarding and challenging all at the same time. Having those site visits and those visitors come in, although I had some great colleagues that came to visit me, it was challenging and a little tense. It made things very tense at times because you
I
didn't
would
know what
imagine
questions.
so, especially with the uncertainty that the students would feel about whether their degrees would give them access to bar exams in other places.
Exactly. And although UNLV was going through that process, they had achieved accreditation by the time I joined them, and they just had heard about it at that point. So this was yet another challenge and opportunity for me that I had never experienced really literally at that level anyplace else that I'd worked. And got them through accreditation, I'm glad to say, and actually decided to move down to Florida to kind of
Coming
settle.
back full circle,
to work at
your Miami
Oliver,
days, and now here you are back.
Exactly.
Got a little, like the warmer weather down here?
Like the warmer weather down
but
here.
A little chilly on times up in Michigan, I know.
Yes, that's true. Although Charlotte's a beautiful place.
Yeah.
It's one of the nicest cities, I think, you could ever live in.
And Las Vegas is not bad either, as I recall.
True. My husband plays tennis, however, and I will tell you the climate in Charlotte was just about perfect for tennis year-round. Las Vegas is a little hot, even a little hot down here, I will admit.
Yeah, it's delightful now. We're doing this interview in March, and I guess this is the height of your best season.
It is. It is.
If I'd come visiting in about July, I would. It would be a little bit more humid and a little hotter.
It's a little hot to wear a jacket.
Yeah.
My husband and I own property here in Florida, and one of the reasons that I decided to take the job down here was to move to eventually retire down in this area. And I applied for several positions actually 2 years ago, and the position at Ave Maria caught my attention, and I applied, and they made me a colleague, and it's been an interesting experience. That school started, as you said, in Michigan.
Yes.
Moved down here in 2009 and went from a very strong paper collection to a very heavily electronic collection. And still dealing with some of the aftermath of that. There's a lot of cleanup that still remains to be done. So yet again, another challenge that I didn't anticipate. I knew that we were very, there would be a lot of challenges at Ave Maria. One of them was going to be the level of staffing. It's a very, very small staff, but the student body is also very small. And that was one of the other things that attracted me to come down here. They admit about 100 to 170 students every cycle. So, and they don't have summer classes, which was another thing that I thought would be interesting. So it was great. It was great to come down and find out a little bit more about the background of religion and law, which I had never had.
That's right. Ave Maria is very focused on sort of the traditional Roman Catholic concepts of what is right and wrong. I remember when it was about in the process of being founded, this was, I guess, back about 20 years ago, I was over at Catholic U in Washington, D.C. for some event, and one of the fellows that I met there, was on their faculty, was going to be one of the first dean, I think, at Ave Maria.
Bernard Dobransky, yes.
Yeah, and it was interesting talking with him. It was an interesting concept. You know, there are a few other schools that have sort of a religious focus. Baylor, for example, in Waco, Texas. BYU up in Utah. And probably others that, you know, but Ave Maria is very much in that mode.
Yes, they are. And
that must make it a little different and challenging in its own way.
It does. Their collection, their ecclesiastical canon law and natural law collection, it's probably one of the best in the country. They've spent a lot of money being sure that they had a lot of both paper and electronic materials to support those areas of study. Their scholars work in those areas, and so getting up to speed to be able to help them is something that was a challenge right at the very beginning as well. The Catholic intellectual tradition is a very, very interesting study in and of itself, and it's kept me busy for the last
the church
nearly 2
during
years.
the so-called Dark Ages was the place where scholarship and learning was sort of kept and preserved at times when society around it wasn't really into that kind of thing.
That's correct.
Yeah.
And St. Thomas Aquinas and
Very much.
Sir Thomas More are two of the spearheads for an oratorical contest that we hold at the Ave Maria School of Law every year. And it's held in the library. So again, yet another wrinkle, something a little different that I've been able to experience just because of moving around the country.
Well, you've certainly had sort of a variety of experiences, as I sort of asked or suggested as we started this part of the interview, but you've done a few other things in the associations. You've already mentioned that you were president of the Colorado Association of Law Librarians, and you've done some writing for our publications and that sort of thing. Do you have any thoughts or want to talk briefly about that at all?
Well, the opportunities I had for leadership were, I think, probably the things that, again, have created the long-lasting relationships that I've had with other people. I was on the membership and recruitment committee for AALL, and that was actually a wonderful experience. Again, there were things that people had completed that I was able to utilize and hopefully improve, and I think that's probably what most of us that go into a committee are hoping to do. Some process improvement, some efficiency improvement, some documentation improvement of some kind, just adding to what's been done in the past. And I hear some great ideas, and so many of them come from our younger colleagues who are now up and coming in the profession. I would say I've learned so much from some of the 20 and 30-year-olds that are in the profession and in the pipeline
There's
now.
an enthusiasm we all had at that age,
Correct.
or at least I think most of us had, and I don't want to say it sort of dissipated a bit with a little longer track record in the field, but the young are really so enthusiastic usually, and it's
Yes.
exciting to hear what they are really thinking. And that sort of folds into what I thought I might ask you a little bit about. You have been involved in membership and retention and recruitment into the field. Do you have any thoughts that you have about the future and say the next few years for law libraries in general and our profession specifically?
Well, I think if I were to tell somebody who was thinking about going into librarianship today what they should do, I would mention getting some background in technical services functions and learning how to deal with information flow and information management. It's not libraries per se as much as it is the information contained in them, around them, and coming through them through the electronic pipelines. I've said this to people for many years now. If you're in technical services and you do a great job, perhaps as a serials librarian, perhaps as somebody dealing with acquisitions, serials control, you're going to rule the world someday. And you are, because that's the direction collections are going to be going. They're going to be electronic. We need to be keyed into ensuring that those collections are managed well, that access is driven by patron need, that we are seen as the people who, the librarians, are seen as the people who, even if we're not supplying that one-on-one interaction, have supplied it at the back end so that it's easy for a patron to access that information. And if I were looking at the direction the world is going, I'd be looking at information security. I would be looking at social networking and whether that's working or not. In fact, I write in that area. I'm writing an article right now on best practices for social networking. And I hope to finish it really soon and challenge some people to think about how to disseminate best practices.
I would think that would be very useful, because there are so many opportunities for experimentation, and then how do you validate what works and what doesn't? And it sounds like you're looking somewhat at that.
Looking at that and privacy.
Privacy.
Yes. Looking
That's
at
right.
that.
Big Brother.
Yes, exactly.
Having come on the airplane to come and do these interviews and standing there with my arms over my head and knowing someone in some side room was seeing more of me than I was comfortable with.
Exactly.
Privacy is a big thing.
It is a big thing.
Yeah.
You know, the social networking that's our students are doing right now, they're not even thinking about. So challenging them to think about how it's changing our lives and how those access points could benefit them or work to their detriment. Those are the kinds of things that I think we all need to be looking at. But I think libraries can be, librarians can be leaders in that area.
That's good. Maybe on that I should thank you, Bobbie Studwell, for talking to us today. But it is customary to give the person being interviewed the last word, which I usually violate by saying something afterwards, but not always. Is there anything you would like to add before we conclude the interview?
Well, the person who I think made this possible, or at least was good in facilitating it, was Dick Spinelli. And I've had wonderful relation with Dick over the years. He's just been a wonderful man in sickness and in health, and he and I knew each other in Colorado, and I thank him for the opportunity to do this, and I hope he's around to see another group and era of librarians.
Well, Dick is in the process of retiring, and I think that's wonderful too. Having done that myself,
Yes.
It's nice when to wake up any morning and say, well, today's Saturday morning, and mean it.
Exactly.
But I think we'll see a lot more of Dick. He's not totally dropped off the end of the earth or anything
Hope
like
not.
that.
I hope not. He's a
Yeah,
wonderful man.
and he has a lot to do with this oral history project, even though he has informed me that, you know, I and the other two persons who are currently involved in conducting interviews, Michelle Wu at Georgetown and Frank Hodak at Southern Illinois, we basically put together the list of colleagues with whom we ought to be talking and for interview purposes. And Dick has made suggestions, but the Hine Company has decided that it's really up to us as the colleagues to make those decisions. And I can appreciate that, but Dick has been extremely helpful and wonderful to me as well over the
Yes.
years. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pat. It's really been wonderful to get a chance to chat with you again.
Well, it's wonderful to be able to do this sort of thing, and hope to see you at upcoming national meetings of our association.
I hope so too.
Thank you, Bobbie.
Thank you.
Yeah.